Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale, and I am joined by Christoph.
Hello, hello. Or ahoy, ahoy, hoy? I don't know. Yes, hello.
Ahoy hoy. That's Alexander Graham Bell's first greeting that he wanted to impose on everybody.
That's right, instead of hello.
Yes. Hey, there's some history for you.
That's right, we're already diving in. That's how serious we take this.
All right. Let's take a step back from the better-known theaters of World War I. Most of us are familiar with the trenches of the Eastern Front, the Gallipoli landings, or perhaps the desert warfare in the Middle East. But far to the east, high in the mountains where Europe fades into Asia, another war was being fought. One that would pit empires against each other, not just with rifles and artillery, but with snow, starvation, and sheer attrition. This was the Caucasus campaign.
I was going to say, if there's snow, Russia is involved.
Yes. So, the name might sound remote, and it is. The Caucasus Mountains, forming a natural barrier between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, lies between modern-day Turkey, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and southern Russia. Today, they're known for ski resorts, disputed borders, and oil pipelines. But in 1914, they were the stage for a brutal and transformative conflict that would reshape Eurasia. Now, you might be wondering, what does this have to do with the U.S. Navy? After all, there weren't American ships off the coast of Batam, but like many land campaigns in history, this one was shaped and at times enabled by maritime power. Let's talk supply lines. The Russian Empire, though vast, had notoriously poor internal transportation. Its western front was linked by rail, but in the Caucasus, soldiers relied heavily on coastal ports for resupply. Cities like Batam and the Black Sea were crucial logistical hubs. Munitions, food, and even winter gear were all shipped into these ports and sent up into the mountains. The Russian Black Sea Fleet protected these lines, patrolling against Ottoman attempts to cut them off. Without that naval shield, Russian forces in the Caucasus might have collapsed far earlier. Now, shift focus south to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were fighting a war on multiple fronts: Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and the Caucasus. And they were stretched thin. But their motivations in the Caucasus were deep and ideological. Enver Pasha, one of the ruling kings of the Ottoman Empire, dreamed of uniting all Turkic peoples in a vast pan-Turkic empire stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia.
Whoa.
To him, the Russian-controlled Caucasus wasn't just a battlefield, it was the doorway to his vision. There were also strategic stakes. The Ottomans, along with their German allies, saw an opportunity to strike Russia at its soft underbelly. If they could capture the Caucasus, they'd gain access to the Caspian oil fields, especially Baku. It had become one of the largest petroleum-producing centers in the world by 1900. Control of Baku's oil field could fuel the Ottoman war machine and deny that same resource to the Entente powers. On the Russian side, the Caucasus had long been a zone of imperial ambition. The Russian Empire had annexed parts of the region from Persia and the Ottomans over the previous century. By 1914, it controlled Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and an ethnically diverse population that included Armenians, Kurds, Georgians, Azeris, Cossacks, and Russians. The Russian Caucasus Army was a mixed force, both in structure and loyalty. Unlike the massive conscript armies of the Western Front, this force had a strong local component. Armenian volunteer units, for example, played a critical role. Many Armenians saw the war as a chance to fight for autonomy, or even statehood, against the empire that had long oppressed them, the Ottomans. But the terrain itself may have been the fiercest opponent of all. The Caucasus Mountains are steep, rugged, and prone to brutal winters. Campaigns here weren't just about maneuver and artillery, they were about survival. Entire battalions froze to death in the snow. Supply animals perished by the thousands. There were avalanches, frostbite, starvation, and the constant threat of ambush in narrow passes. Imagine being a soldier in that world. You're thousands of feet above sea level. The snow is up to your chest. You're low on food. Your boots are falling apart. And the only warmth is the man huddled next to you. Meanwhile, artillery thunders in the distance, and the next village might be friendly or already burned.
That sounds pretty awful. I mean, I don't know what the listener is envisioning, but there was an expression I heard recently from a Chicagoan, and it went something to the effect of, the weather is never the problem, it's how you're dressed is the problem. Are you dressed for the weather? And chest-high snow would take a special amount of insulation. And I don't think these soldiers were equipped for that. Fighting in these different terrains and having the right gear for all these different situations, I don't think is something that many of these armies considered.
Nope. Unlike the static trench warfare of France, the Caucasus front was mobile, chaotic, and deeply personal. Entire villages changed hands multiple times. Guerrilla warfare and ethnic reprisals were common. The front lines weren't always clearly drawn, and because of the sheer remoteness of the region, commanders on both sides had difficulty receiving and executing orders. As the war opened, the Russians enjoyed an advantage. Their supply lines were relatively stable thanks to the Black Sea ports and their forces, under General Bregman and later General Yudenich, had experience fighting in the region. The Ottoman forces, by contrast, were inexperienced in mountain warfare. Enver Pasha's dream of a lightning strike into Russian territory would soon meet the cold hand of reality. But more on that in a little while. It is important to recognize, too, how this front foreshadowed modern conflicts. The Caucasus has remained a region of conflict through the 20th and 21st centuries. The borders created, or contested, during this campaign laid the groundwork for future wars in Nagorno-Karabakh, Kaza, South Ossetia, and Chechnya. Most of that legacy begins here in World War I, as empires died and new nations were born. But before we move into the specifics of the campaign, the disasters, the victories, the atrocities, keep this border frame in mind. The Caucasus campaign was a war within a war. It was a regional conflict nested inside a global conflagration. It involved imperial ambitions, ethnic survival, resource warfare, and ideological dreams. And through it all, the sea, the Black Sea, was a lifeline, a critical conduit of supplies, reinforcements, and even hopes. So next we're going to take you into the heart of one of the world's greatest military disasters, the Battle of Sakaramish, where Enver Pasha's dream met the reality of snow, ice, and Russian resistance.
So, before you continue, you mentioned something at the beginning that I think was a huge miscalculation by this guy when he said he was going to attack Russia via its soft underbelly. Not soft. Just, the Caucasus Mountains are treacherous, and sounds like, I guess you will unfold exactly what happened, but this seemed like a huge tactical mistake. But of course, It's easy for me to say almost 100 years, actually over 100 years later.
Over 100 years, yes. 120.
Yeah, that's nuts.
121 years.
So yes, continue.
Happily. All right. As we continue our exploration of the Caucasus campaign, we come to the campaign's dramatic and disastrous opening act. Two early offensives that would set the tone for the rest of the war in the region. These were the Bregman Offensive, launched by the Russians in November of 1914, and the Ottoman response, the Battle of Sarikamish, which remains one of the most infamous military debacles of the First World War. Let's begin in the waning days of autumn 1914. The war was just weeks old in the Caucasus. The Russian Empire, wary of Ottoman intentions, decided to make the first move. They launched what became known as the Bergman Offensive, named after General Georgy Bergman, a commander under the Russian Caucasus Army.
I want to say, when you said most notorious debacles and then said, hey, this offensive was named after the general, that's never the position you want to be in. You never want to be the guy that had an offensive named after you that is also equated to one of the most infamous military debacles. So all you future generals out there, watch what you're doing.
You are absolutely correct. So the objective was modest. Push into Ottoman-held territory near the border, seize high ground, and test Ottoman defenses before winter locked the region in snow and ice. Bregman's forces moved quickly, and at first they succeeded. They advanced across the border, took several villages, and captured key ridge positions. But the Ottomans responded with surprising strength. Harsh winter, poor coordination, and stiff Ottoman resistance turned the Russian advance into a stalemate, and then a retreat. By mid-November, Bergman's troops were exhausted. They had suffered up to 40% casualties, many from frostbite and exposure. The offensive was called off. It hadn't been a full-blown catastrophe, but it was a warning. This would be no easy fight.
And this is in the autumn. Like, it's not even winter yet.
Yeah.
Oof.
But if the Russians had underestimated the terrain, the Ottomans were about to take that mistake to a deadly extreme. Enter Enver Pasha, Minister of War and one of the three pashas who ruled the Ottoman Empire during the war. Enver was young, ambitious, and convinced he could deliver a decisive blow to Russia by launching a grand offensive of his own. His plan? A bold envelopment maneuver that would outflank and surround the Russians at the town of Charikamish.
I keep hearing, like, detectives in there, and it's like, you messed up for the last time. It's like, oh, sorry, Kamish. So, I don't know if that's helpful.
A key to a logistical hub deep in Russian territory. Enver believed that if he could encircle and destroy the Russian Caucasus army there, the road would be open to Kars, Tifs, and eventually deeper into the Caucasus. On paper, it was a daring plan. In practice, it was a suicide march.
Yeah.
The operation began in late December 1914, right in the heart of one of the worst winters the region had seen in years.
Gosh, of course.
Enver divided his Third Army into several columns, each of which was ordered to cross narrow mountain passes in sub-zero temperatures. These soldiers, many conscripts from the warmer regions of Anatolia, were poorly equipped for winter warfare. They lacked adequate food, clothing, and even boots.
That seems, I don't know. You assume your leadership has some idea of what they're getting into when they launch a major offensive, but to not have boots when you're going into a very cold climate seems, well, like you said, suicidal.
Yeah. The Allahu Ekbar mountains. Yes, literally the God is Great mountains.
I was going to say, yeah.
Stood between them and their objective. Soldiers climbed these peaks in single file, with sleet and snow driving into their faces. Visibility was often no more than a few feet. Entire units vanished into snowdrifts or collapsed from hypothermia. Horses and mules died by the thousands. Many of them simply dropped where they froze. Their carcasses later used as makeshift windbreaks by desperate soldiers. As if that wasn't bad enough, the coordination among the columns was appalling. Delays, miscommunications, and broken supply lines meant that some Ottoman units reached Sarikamish days ahead of others. Instead of a single, synchronized strike, the attack came piecemeal.
Oh, yeah.
Easily repulsed by the Russian defenders, who were cold and tired themselves, but entrenched and holding interior lines. The Russians, under General Yudenovich, responded swiftly. They allowed the Ottomans to funnel into the narrow valleys and mountain trails. Then they struck. Artillery fire from ridges tore into frozen Ottoman ranks. Russian infantry made use of skis and snowshoes, giving them superior mobility. What resulted was not a battle, but a massacre.
Okay, so the Bergen offensive or Bergman offensive wasn't the debacle. It was this Enver Pasha move that was the debacle, correct?
Yeah,
this is
bad.
horrible. I'm going to do Monday morning quarterbacking after you're done describing this, but go ahead. I want to see how it actually unfolds before my alternate plan.
Okay. By early January 1915, it was over. The Ottoman Third Army had been virtually annihilated. Some of the 90,000 men who began the operation, only around 10,000 returned. Some estimates put the number of dead and missing as high as 75 to 80,000. Though, of course, precise figures vary.
Yeah, that's... oof.
And here's the astonishing part. Most of these men didn't die in combat. They died in the cold, in the mountains, in the snow, without ever firing a shot. Enver Pasha, ever the political survivor, blamed the defeat not on his reckless strategy, but on a familiar scapegoat, the Armenians.
Oh.
He claimed that they had betrayed the Ottoman war effort by siding with the Russians. This unfounded accusation would help set in motion one of the darkest chapters of the war, the Armenian genocide, which we will explore a little later. But from a military standpoint, Sakramish was a disaster of the highest order. It crippled Ottoman offensive capabilities in the Caucasus for years. The Third Army would not recover its strength until well into 1916.
Wow.
And even then, it would never pose the same kind of threat again.
That stinks for the Ottomans that was their first offensive. You know what I mean? Like to have a huge army push through treacherous terrain and have them ripped up just by, and then never really regain that strength for years during a massive war. That's what a calamity. Are you ready to hear my alternate plan?
We are almost done with the segment.
Okay, cool. I'll keep it chambered.
Yeah. And from a strategic point of view, it brought the Russians precious time. With the Ottoman threat temporarily neutralized, Russia could stabilize the Caucasus front and prepare for a counteroffensive that would eventually see them take key Ottoman cities, including Erzurum, the empire's eastern fortress. Let's take a step back and consider what this battle teaches us about logistics. Enver Pasha's plan ignored not just the enemy, but the environment. His troops lacked cold weather gear, food, and reliable maps. The Russian advantage wasn't just in numbers or terrain. It was in supply. Thanks to their Black Sea ports, the Russians could bring in coal, uniforms, ammunition, and even specialized mountain troops. That lifeline protected the Russian Black Sea fleet, proved critical to survival and victory. Here's another layer to consider. While the Ottomans were freezing in the mountains, the British Navy was beginning its campaigns in the Dardanelles. The Gallipoli landings would come just months later, Had Enver succeeded in the Caucasus, history might have played out very differently. But with his army shattered, the Ottomans were thrown on the defensive across multiple fronts.
Mm-hmm.
So, in summary, the Battle of Sakramish stands as a powerful example of hubris, poor planning, and the devastating power of nature. It's also a reminder that in wartime, especially in rugged terrain like the Caucasus, logistics can be more decisive than bullets.
Definitely. Oh my gosh. All right. Here we go. I don't know if you know about where the Caucasus Mountains are, listener, but pull up a map. I'll give you time. Okay, I'm assuming you paused and already looked up the map. It's on the border, Azerbaijan, Georgia, like right there, and it's flanked. The range is flanked by two seas, the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, and so as Dale was talking about, the Russians are getting supplied by these Black Sea ports, coal, uniforms, ammunition, everything they need. All you would have to do, and this would take some coordination, is put your army on ships and go around the mountains and make a landing somewhere on the other side of the mountains. And then you don't have to worry about the rugged terrain because you will have bypassed it. And there are two options, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, or both. And then you can meet in the middle. You can do that envelopment via the sea. And this being a Navy podcast, I think that is the more appropriate approach. So what do you think, Dale? It couldn't have been worse than what happened.
Oh, it could always be worse. Everybody could have died.
Yeah, okay. You got me there. But not of cold. Unless the seas are cold.
Those seas are cold.
Okay. Yeah, I guess in autumn especially. Ugh, what a disaster. Well, that was my idea. Listeners, if you have alternate game theory about what could have happened and how the Ottomans could have been successful, please let us know.
All right. So, after the catastrophic failure of the Ottoman offensive at Sakramish, the Caucasus front entered a period of uneasy quiet. Both armies had suffered tremendous losses. The Ottomans were reeling. Tens of thousands of men lost not in battle, but to exposure and starvation. The Russian Caucasus army, while victorious, was severely depleted and immobilized by winter conditions. For a while, neither side was capable of launching a major campaign. But empires don't rest for long. And by the end of 1915, one of them was preparing to strike back hard. The Russian Empire, under the leadership of General Nikolai Yudenich, began planning a massive counteroffensive to capitalize on the weakened state of the Ottoman Third Empire, of the Ottoman Third Army. Yudenich, who had distinguished himself at Sakramish, was now given full command of the Caucasus front. He was a sharp-minded commander with a rare ability to combine operational daring with methodical preparation. Exactly the kind of general the campaign demanded. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the scale of what he was up against. The Russian objective was Erzurum, a highly fortified city in eastern Anatolia. Situated on a high plateau, Erzurum was the Ottoman Empire's strongest defensive position in the east. It featured two concentric lines of forts,
Wow.
high ridges with entrenched artillery, and natural barriers in every direction. Taking the city wouldn't require just courage. It would require climbing frozen mountains, crossing rivers, and breaking through a network of 20 forts that guarded the city's approaches.
Whoa.
The Russian plan relied on surprise, speed, and most importantly, supplies.
Yes.
So this is where naval logistics come into the story again. While the terrain was brutal and roads were often impassable, the Black Sea Fleet and port cities like Batum allowed the Russians to maintain a steady stream of war material. Coal, rifle, shells, canned food, warm clothing, even telegraph wire. Nearly all of it arrived by sea. The ability to secure and supply a remote highland campaign through maritime access is often overlooked in histories of the Caucasus campaign, but it cannot be overstated. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, had to drag its supplies over land from western Anatolia, a trek of hundreds of miles through bad roads and hostile territory. So while the Ottomans struggled to rebuild their shattered Third Army, Yudenich quickly stockpiled everything he needed. He also trained specialized units for mountain warfare. Ski battalions, sappers, pack animal handlers, and he used local Armenian volunteers as guides and scouts familiar with the terrain. In January of 1916, he struck. What followed was one of the most successful winter offensives of the entire First World War. The Russians advanced rapidly along multiple axes. They maneuvered through waist-deep snow, climbed over mountain passes that the Ottomans believed impassable, and forced river crossings in the dead of night. Some units moved on skis, others rode sledges pulled by horses or even men. Despite the conditions, they kept moving fast. The Ottoman defenders were caught off guard. Their intelligence services had failed to anticipate the scale or timing of the Russian assault. Their reserves were thin. Their supply lines were overstretched. And critically, many of the defensive forts had been poorly maintained or were under-garrisoned due to losses at Sakramish and subsequent redeployments. Over the course of several weeks, Russian forces breached the outer ring of forts, then the interior defenses. There were moments of fierce resistance, but morale in the Ottoman ranks was low. As panic spread, command cohesion broke down. On February 16, 1916, Russian forces entered Erzurum.
Wow.
Let that sink in for a moment. A city that had been fortified for decades, a symbol of Ottoman strength in the east, captured in the dead of winter during what should have been a season of hibernation for both armies.
That's what Hannibal did, right? Through the Alps to attack Rome. Nobody expected it at that time. Nobody had their guard up, and they were just like, this is impossible. And once again, that lack of focus, especially during wartime, cost them dearly.
Mm-hmm. This was no small victory. Erzurum's fall not only represented a massive territorial gain, it shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility in Anatolia. The road to Trabzon, the empire's key Black Sea port, now lay open, and didn't stop there.
Oh.
In the months that followed, Russian troops continued pushing westward. They captured Mus, Bitlis, and eventually Trabzon itself by April, securing a critical new supply point. Once again, naval power played a decisive role. The Russian Black Sea Fleet, operating largely uncontested at this point, helped ferry troops and equipment along the coast. It also bombarded Ottoman positions, softening resistance ahead of inland advances. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, how was it that the Ottomans, despite having the shorter internal lines and defending their own territory, were losing ground so rapidly? Well, it comes down to four major factors. Leadership. Yudenich was one of Russia's best generals, and Pasha, on the other hand, was out of his depth. His ego had already cost the empire an army. 2. Morale. The Ottoman Third Army was broken. Sakramish had crushed their spirit, and Erzurum confirmed that they could no longer rely on fortifications alone. 3. Logistics.
Mm-hmm.
As we mentioned before, Russia could supply its army via the Black Sea. The Ottomans were dragging wagons through mud, snow, and hostile territory. 4. Terrain familiarity. Russian forces made good use of local Armenian and Georgian guides. The Ottomans, suspicious of their own Christian minorities, lacked this human terrain intelligence. By the summer of 1916, the Russian Empire had pushed over 100 miles into Ottoman territory. The eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire were collapsing. For a brief window, it looked like the Russians might even make a play for Mesopotamia, or link up with British forces in Persia. But then, history intervened. Back home, Russia was beginning to crack.
Oh, yeah.
Food shortages, military defeats on other fronts, and growing revolutionary sentiment were taking their toll. The Tsar's government was wobbling. Within a year, it would fall entirely, and with it, the will to continue the war in the Caucasus. But that's the next part of our story.
Oh.
For now, let's reflect on what made the Erzurum offensive so remarkable. It was one of the few true operational masterpieces of World War I. A rapid, coordinated, and devastating campaign executed in one of the harshest environments imaginable. It demonstrated that with proper planning, motivated troops, and strong logistical support, especially by sea, a seemingly impossible objective could be achieved. And it shifted the momentum in the Caucasus front for the next 18 months.
Yeah, I mean, the demoralization alone would have been significant for the Ottomans. Not to mention, that had to be like a base of operations, a foothold in the region. And with that gone, how do they coordinate or deploy troops in that area? And so it would be a lot easier for the Russians to roll on, like you said, especially with naval support. When you talk about going all the way to Trabzon, I looked it up, and that's right on the coast of the Black Sea. And so, again, the Russians can move in, but then they can also be supplied by their naval counterparts, the Army-Navy support. So that's, I guess, lucky for the Ottomans. The Russians went through a huge revolution. I mean, oof.
All right. So as 1916 turned into 1917, the Russian Empire was in a commanding position in the Caucasus. The stunning victory at Erzurum, the capture of Trabzon, and continued westward advances had pushed Ottoman forces back across much of eastern Anatolia. The Russians held key ports, mountain passes, and high ground. But while the front lines were stable, the empires behind them were anything but. Let's begin with the ground reality. Following their dramatic offensive successes, Russian troops dug in along a front that ran from the eastern Black Sea coast near Trabzon, down through Erzurum, and south towards Lake Van. Ottoman forces, still reeling from their defeats, regrouped slowly under new leadership. But the grand offensives of 1916 had exhausted both sides. What followed was a period of attritional warfare, minor advances, probing raids, and positional battles in high-altitude trenches.
Ooh.
Conditions were horrific. Soldiers lived in freezing outposts where hypothermia, scurvy, and typhus were as lethal as Ottoman bullets. The terrain favored neither side. Sheer ridges, avalanche-prone slopes, and frozen rivers made even simple movements a logistical ordeal. And yet, during this grim and grinding period, a new force began to reshape the battlefield: Armenian volunteer units. Now, we've mentioned them before, but it's time to take a closer look. The Armenians had long been caught between the Russian and Ottoman empires. With a large population living in both, they were vulnerable to suspicion and repression from both sides. But when the war began, many Armenians saw this as an opportunity to fight for autonomy, even independence. Thousands of Armenians enlisted in the Russian Caucasus army, forming dedicated battalions often led by former resistance fighters who had previously battled Ottoman repression in eastern Anatolia. These units had unmatched knowledge of the terrain. They knew the mountain passes, the water sources, the weather patterns, and perhaps more importantly, they were fighting for their own homes.
That's a huge motivator.
It is. Their contributions were immense. Armenian forces secured rear supply routes, guided Russian divisions through otherwise impassable regions, and in many cases led their own attacks on Ottoman positions. These weren't auxiliary troops. They were front-line soldiers, often taking the brunt of engagements in places like Bitlis and Van. But with their growing visibility came growing danger.
Oh, yeah.
In 1915, following the Ottoman defeat at Sakramish, Enver Pasha and the Ottoman leadership had accused Armenians of aiding the enemy. This accusation was used as a pretext for mass deportation, forced marches, and massacres that would come to be known as the Armenian Genocide. Over 1 million Armenians perished. Entire communities vanished. Churches and schools were destroyed. Survivors fled east into Russian territory or west into Persia and beyond. But for those who remained, fighting with the Russians wasn't just political, it was personal. But even as Armenian units helped hold the front, the Russian Empire was unraveling. The cracks that had widened in 1916 broke open in 1917.
Gee.
First came the February Revolution, which toppled Tsar Nicholas II and brought a provisional government to power. The new leaders pledged to keep fighting the war, but morale on the front lines collapsed. Soldiers who had already endured years of hardship, cold, and pointless offenses saw no reason to continue. In the Caucasus, this disintegration was slow but steady. Units began ignoring orders. Desertions increased. Radical propaganda spread through the trenches. Bolshevik agitators and local revolutionaries began to organize soldiers' committees, questioning the authorities of officers. Supply lines faltered. Ammunition shortages became common.
Oh, yeah.
Even food became irregular. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, some forces continued to resist. Chief among them, the Armenian and Georgian national units.
Yep, that's their homeland. That's what they're going to do.
Along with the elements of the Russian command still loyal to the idea of holding the line. And let's not forget that the Black Sea was still a lifeline. Even as the empire fractured, Russian naval control of the coast helped stave off total collapse. Supplies from Batum continued, though more erratically, to reach frontline positions. The Black Sea Fleet, while experiencing its own revolutionary breakdown, remained a check on Ottoman ambitions. Still, the tide was turning. By October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd. Their slogan was simple: peace, land, and bread.
Yeah.
To achieve peace, they would need to pull Russia out of the war entirely, no matter the cost. In the Caucasus, this meant a slow, chaotic withdrawal. Russian regular units began to disband. Officers fled or were executed. The centralized command system collapsed. What was left was a patchwork of ethnic militias, national councils, and local volunteers trying to maintain order. In some areas, Armenians held their lines desperately. They knew what would happen if the Ottomans returned. In other regions, Georgian and Azeri factions began carving out their own zones of control. The seeds of future nation-states were being sown even as the war raged on. What makes this period so fascinating and so chaotic is the sheer number of overlapping conflicts. You had a formal war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. You had an ethnic conflict, especially between Turks and Armenians. You had a revolutionary struggle inside Russia. And you had the birth of national independence movements across the Caucasus. Add to that the looming presence of foreign interests, Germany eyeing oil in Baku, Britain deploying missions like Dunster Force, and France watching nervously from afar, and you had the makings of a geopolitical powder keg. So, why does this matter for us? Looking back at this history, because the entire house of cards rested on supply, and supply required the sea. Had the Black Sea ports fallen earlier, had the Ottoman or German naval power severed those routes,
Oh,
the
yeah.
Russians might have collapsed in 1916, not 1918. And it's also not glamorous work. You don't get medals for ferrying coal across the water, or for guarding a convoy out of Batum. But that's what made the Caucasus Front possible. And it's what's made the Russian collapse so tragic. They had the advantage. They had the terrain. They had the initiative. But they lost the empire before they could win the war.
Yeah, in a way, that affected not just morale, but like you're saying, logistics. When you're talking about food or coal or ammunition, that stuff isn't a priority for your remote troops when your entire government is collapsing. You know what I mean? So
Mm-hmm.
that's going to go to where it's needed, and that's local. And
Yeah.
a lot of folks that were unhappy with the czar that wanted food aren't going to be willing to give up that food that they fought so hard for to some fighters in a faraway land doing the czar's bidding. And so, yes, they had the logistical supply lines, but once it fell, it was over.
So, as the dust settled over the frozen peaks and battered plains of the Caucasus, 1917 ushered in not just a new year, but a new world order. One in which empires crumbled, alliances shattered, and the very map of Eurasia would be redrawn. The great Russian Empire that had long ruled the Caucasus was no more. The Russian Revolution swept through the empire like a wildfire, topping the centuries-old Tsarist regime and replacing it with a volatile and radical Bolshevik government. The war-weary Russian army, stretched thin and demoralized, began to dissolve in the face of internal upheaval. On the Caucasus front, this chaos was particularly acute. Russian soldiers, many of whom had already endured years of harsh mountain warfare, abandoned their posts en masse.
Hmm.
Units disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance or simply melted away. Officers struggled to maintain order as revolutionary committees took command in many units. The front line became porous, vulnerable to Ottoman advances. The Bolsheviks' priority was clear: exit the war as quickly as possible. This led to negotiations with the Central Powers, culminating in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March of 1918. By this treaty, Russia ceded vast territories, including much of the Caucasus, to the Ottomans and their allies.
Whoa. Oh, can you imagine
What
fighting
does...
for all those years and then that just, in an instant, all those gains are just, they vanish. All your sacrifice just for naught.
Yeah. What does this mean on the ground? It meant that Russian forces, the bulwark that had held the Ottoman Empire back for years, were withdrawing or disarming. The Ottomans, who had been battered and demoralized themselves, suddenly found their eastern frontier wide open. One of the most coveted prizes was the city of Baku, the jewel of the Caspian Basin. By 1918, Baku was a central, critical oil-producing center, pumping out nearly half of the world's oil supply.
Whoa.
Whoever controlled Baku controlled the lifeblood of modern warfare: fuel. For the Ottomans, securing Baku was more than a military objective. It was vital for their very survival. Their war effort, already weakened by years of fighting on multiple fronts, depended on access to oil to power ships, vehicles, and industry. But Baku was no easy prize. The city was a mosaic of ethnic groups: Armenians, Russians, and many others, many of whom distrusted one another. Political factions vied for control amidst the chaos of collapsing empires. Into this vacuum stepped the British. Alarmed at the prospect of Ottoman and, by extension, German control of the Caspian oil fields.
Mm-hmm.
The British response came in the form of a small but elite military mission called Dunster Force, named after its commander, General Lionel Dunsterville. Dunster Force was comprised of seasoned officers and troops tasked with organizing local forces to defend Baku from the advancing Ottoman Third Army, which had regrouped under new commanders. Dunster Force's mission was desperate and difficult. Their forces were outnumbered, the local population divided, and the front lines fluid and chaotic. Armenian militias, fiercely motivated by the memory of genocide and the desire to defend their homeland, formed the backbone of the defense, alongside small contingents of Russian loyalists and British troops. For months, fierce battles raged outside Baku. The Ottomans pushed hard, employing traditional infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, and irregular cavalry raids. The defenders, despite heroism and determination, were gradually worn down by constant pressure. In September of 1918, after months of fighting, the Ottoman forces launched a decisive attack. The city fell on September 15th, after bitter street fighting. The Ottoman and Azerbaijani forces took control of Baku, delivering a significant strategic blow to the Entente. Yet, this victory was short-lived.
Oh, yeah, September 1918. Mm-hmm.
Just over a month later, the tides of war turned dramatically with the signing of the Armistice of Mudros on October 30th, 1918. The armistice ended Ottoman participation in World War I and forced the empire to withdraw from occupied territories, including the Caucasus.
Oh, man.
Baku and the surrounding region soon fell under Allied control. The British moved swiftly to stabilize the area, supporting the establishment of new governments in Armenia and Georgia. But the legacy of the Caucasus campaign and the bitter battles over its rugged mountains and rich oil fields would echo for decades. So why is this important for naval historian enthusiasts? Because once again, the sea proved decisive. The British Navy's control of the Black Sea and Persian Gulf routes were essential in projecting power into the Caucasus. British and Allied naval operations supplied Dunster Force and evacuated civilians during the fall of Baku. The struggle for control over coastal ports and maritime supply lines was as fierce as the battles fought on snow-covered peaks. Moreover, the competition for oil in the Caucasus foreshadowed the geopolitical struggles that would define the 20th century, including the rise of American and British naval power to protect global energy supplies. The stakes of the Caucasus campaign extended far beyond the mountains. It was an early chapter in the global race for resources that continues today. As empires collapsed and new nations emerged from the ruins, the Caucasus stood at a crossroads between Europe and Asia, empire and independence, war and peace.
Yeah, the British really, at the end of World War I, did so much from a nation-building standpoint, or at least a nation-border definition standpoint. I know the whole Middle East was carved up in a very unusual manner by the British. And so, I don't know. It's so interesting to see what the consequences are of the different involvement when, I mean, imagine how far away the UK is from this area. And then they come in to help secure the area, which I can appreciate, and are able to do so with a strong navy, which is awesome. But without, I don't know how much input they got from the locals, right? I mean, you were talking about how important that was for the Russian forces to have the local guides from Armenia and whatnot to be knowledgeable about the terrain, the weather, the logistics of everything. Gosh, I don't know. It seems there's so many messes that come out of World War I. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think, is one of them.
Yes. All right. So, as the guns fell silent and the empires that had fought in the Caucasus crumbled, the region was left scarred but transformed. The Caucasus campaign had been brutal, chaotic, and often overshadowed by the more famous battles on the Western Front, or Gallipoli. Yet its consequences reached far beyond the snow-covered peaks and oil-soaked valleys. First, let's talk about the immediate aftermath. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 led to the emergence of new political entities in the Caucasus. The Democratic Republic of Armenia, the Democratic Republic of Azerbaijan, and the Democratic Republic of Georgia declared independence in 1918. For a fleeting moment, the Caucasus was no longer a contested borderland of empires, but a region of nascent nation-states. But independence was fragile. The boundaries of these new countries were contested, and ethnic tensions, exasperated by wartime atrocities, fueled ongoing conflict. The legacy of the Armenian genocide left deep wounds. Azerbaijan, backed by the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey, clashed with Armenia and Georgia in a series of territorial disputes. Meanwhile, the Allied powers, especially Britain, sought to maintain influence in the region to protect strategic interests, particularly oil. British forces remained in parts of the Caucasus until 1920, assisting friendly governments in attempting to stabilize the region. However, the most significant geopolitical shift came in 1921, when the Soviet Red Army invaded and annexed the Caucasus republics, integrating them into the newly formed Soviet Union. The region remained under Soviet control for the better part of the 20th century, with its turbulent history continuing beneath the surface. So, what does that mean for us today? The Caucasus remains a flashpoint. The ethnic, religious, and political fractures exposed and deepened by World War I continue to drive conflicts in places like Nagorno-Karabakh, South Ossetia, and Abkhazia. The great powers' rivalry for control over energy resources in the region echoes the struggles of a century ago. From a naval history perspective, the campaign underscores the critical importance of maritime logistics and land warfare.
Oh, yeah.
Throughout the campaign, control of the Black Sea was essential for resupply, troop movement, and strategic flexibility. The Russian Black Sea's fleet protection of supply routes allowed them to maintain pressure on Ottoman positions in one of the world's most challenging theaters. The Ottomans, by contrast, suffered from a lack of naval power in the Black Sea, which severely limited their ability to project force and sustain their armies. This imbalance highlights a recurring theme in military history. Land campaigns are often won or lost by control of the sea. The Caucasus campaign also offers timeless lessons in leadership and logistics. Enver Pasha's hubris and disregard for environmental realities led to the disaster at Shakarmish, a stark warning about the perils of ignoring terrain, weather, and supply and planning offensives. Meanwhile, General Yudenich's success at Erzurum illustrates how meticulous preparation and coordinated logistics could turn the tide even in the harshest conditions. Finally, the campaign reminds us the human cost of war in forgotten places. Thousands of soldiers, many conscripts unfamiliar with the brutal mountains, died not just from bullets, but from cold, hunger, and disease. Civilians suffered terribly, caught between imperial ambitions and ethnic violence. As historians and enthusiasts, the Caucasus campaign challenges us to look beyond the familiar battlefields and remember that the First World War was a truly global conflict, one where geography, logistics, and political complexity combined to create one of history's most difficult campaigns. So thank you for joining us on this journey through a lesser known but incredibly consequential front of World War I. we are going to honor one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCards.us. Today, we're going to honor Signalman First Class Douglas A. Munro. His hometown was South Cleum, Washington. He served with the U.S. Coast Guard. He was stationed to the U.S. Coast Guard Ship Transport Fleet. He received a Medal of Honor and Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was September 27th, 1942, killed in action at Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. He was 24. Signalman First Class Douglas Munro is the first Coast Guard man to receive the Medal of Honor. On September 27th, 1942, Munro was tasked with leading a group of Higgins boats to drop a Marine battalion at a beachhead known as Point Cruz, near the Manitou River on the island of Guadalcanal. The plan was for the Marines to drive enemy Japanese forces from the river and establish a patrol base further inland. But the Japanese were prepared and countered with heavy fire. With the Marines trapped, Munro volunteered to lead 6 boats back in a rescue mission. As the small Higgins boats could not evacuate 500 all at once, Munro and his fellow Coast Guardsmen made multiple dangerous trips under heavy attack. Under continuous intense fire, Munro positioned his boat as a shield to draw enemy fire away from the other boats and the Marines evacuating from the exposed beach, saving hundreds of Marines and fellow Coast Guard men. Munro was struck down by enemy fire. For his bravery, Munro was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, which President Franklin D. Roosevelt presented to his parents in May of 1943. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty, as petty officer in charge of a group of 24 Higgins boats, engaged in the evacuation of a battalion of Marines trapped by enemy Japanese forces at Point Cruz, Guadalcanal, on 27 September 1942. After making preliminary plans for the evacuation of nearly 500 beleaguered Marines, Munro, under constant strafing by enemy machine guns on the island, and at great risk to his life, daringly led 5 of his small craft towards the shore. As he closed the beach, he signaled the others to land, and then, in order to draw the enemy's fire and protect the heavily loaded boats, he valiantly placed his craft and its 2 small guns as a shield between the beachhead and the Japanese. When the perilous task of evacuation was nearly completed, Munro was instantly killed by enemy fire. But his crew, 2 of whom were wounded, carried on until the last boat was loaded and cleared the beach. By his outstanding leadership, expert planning, and dauntless devotion to duty, he and his courageous comrades undoubtedly saved the lives of many who otherwise would have perished. He gallantly gave his life for his country. In a personal letter written to Munro's parents, Commanding Officer Lieutenant Commander Dexter wrote, "He was among the first to volunteer and was put in charge of the detail. The evacuation was as successful as could be hoped for under fire. But as always happens, the last man to leave the beach are the hardest pressed because they had been acting as the covering agents for the withdrawal. Of the other men, and your son, knowing this is so, placed himself in his boat so that he could act as the covering agent for the last men. And by his action and successful maneuvers brought back a far greater number of men than had ever been hoped for. He received his wound just as the last men were getting into the boats and clearing the beach. Upon regaining consciousness, his only question was, did they get off? And so died with a smile on his face and the full knowledge that he had successfully accomplished a dangerous mission." 3 ships have been named in Douglas Munro's honor.
Wow.
U.S. Navy Destroyer Escort USS Douglas A. Munro, DE-422, along with Coast Guard cutters USCGC Douglas Munro, WHEC-724, and USCG Munro, WMSL-755. Munro Hall at the United States Coast Guard Academy, New London, Connecticut. Munro Hall at the United States Coast Guard Training Center, Cape May, New Jersey. And the Douglas A. Munro Coast Guard Headquarters Building in Washington, D.C. are all named to honor the brave actions of Signalman First Class Douglas Munro. His final words, "Did they get off?" are a lasting symbol of devotion to duty and selfless sacrifice, and Munro's heroism is taught to Coast Guardsmen in training to this day. So, Signalman First Class Douglas A. Monroe, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Christoph, get us out of here.
All right, can do, Captain. So thank you so much for listening, listeners. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. If you'd like to get a hold of us and let us know maybe something interesting you learned, or a story of a relative that fought in the Caucasus campaign, or something like that, or maybe to compliment Dale's rich tones, you can do that in a couple of different ways. First of all, you can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on the website known as X, formerly known as Twitter. X-Twitter, as we like to call it around here. The handle is at US Navy wait, hold on. I always mess this up. USN History Pod. That's it. That's the one. And if you're not sure if I said it right, because maybe I didn't, you can find it in the show notes. So go to the show notes and you'll see the links to the email, X Twitter, and to a Discord server where you can interact with us and other listeners. And you can ask questions, tell stories, etc. You know how Navy folks are. Or maybe you don't and you'd like to find out. Head there. Also, finally, if you want to rate and review us, that would really help us out, because it spreads the word about what we're trying to do here. And tell a friend, tell a coworker, tell a family member, and give us a nice number of stars. And that would be great. Thanks, guys and gals.
And as always, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.